Hey everybody, this is Peter Enns, and I'm here on the Happy Hippie Jesus Show with Jeremy and Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. It's good to be with you today. But I'm
Good.
afraid that
I got everything right. I got the titles right. I got everything because, I don't know what I'm doing.
whatever title you go with, we generally go with. Someone I had to dip you into it once, and someone else called us another name. And I gotta say, I'm a little embarrassed by Bill. He's got this question that he likes to ask everyone.
What did he do this time?
Don't even get me started. But he's got this question that he
seriously.
wants to ask you, and he insists. And I was like, this is not going to go well. So I'm just going to be quiet for a while.
Okay, Jeremy has this really terrible Christology in which he believes that Jesus is stuck in space and time in 33 AD.
Yeah.
And he insists that Jesus is just a Jewish rabbi who is also God and Messiah. But, I say Jesus is a hippie. What do you think?
I don't know. Why is this my problem? You guys need to work this out for yourselves. I never get into other people's problems. I create my own. But why can't it be both?
I think we can take that both as a win.
How's that for a typical academic answer?
Yeah. We'll talk to our couples counselor about it and just kind of get on with the interview.
Yeah, please do that. Yeah.
I do want to know, you can tell me a story. It can be from your own life or from the Bible, or you can just make up a story about, a co-host named Jared or whatever you want to do. But just a story that'll kind of illustrate a little bit about how you understand Jesus.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, here's the thing. This is something I saw on the internet a while back. And when I hit it, when I saw it and just read it, I got a lump in my throat. That doesn't often happen, but it's this meme that maybe at the pearly gates and people are trying to get in, and he's like being really reluctant to let some people in. He's not really sure, and then somebody comes to St. Peter, and one of the other angels comes to him and says, something's going on here because the number of people in here in heaven are a lot bigger than the number of people that we have in our books. So something's going on. So Peter says, we better find out what's happening. So the angels go and they finally find out what the problem is. They come back to report to Peter and they say, we found the problem. We're sitting here at the gate and Jesus is helping other people over the wall. And that really, I saw that and I said, that's it. It's not a Jesus versus Peter thing. It's a Jesus versus established religion thing, and I like that because it makes me think of the grace of God and the bigness of God and of the gospel that we're always trying to sort of minimize in ways that we can control better. And, I look at that, I know the right answer. It's like, oh, you can't say that, just let anybody in. But how do I know? And wouldn't it be great? Is that the worst thing that would ever happen if everyone benefits from this gospel thing in one way or another? I think I like that. That's a very hippie thing to say, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very timely illustration right now, too.
With walls, yeah.
Yes, it is.
No, seriously, but that just brings out, all this, it's just bringing out something that's been there, that's always been there, and it's certainly part of Western Christianity where we want to, this is it's tribalism. It belongs to us, not to anybody else, and we get it right. And, some people are racist about it, some people are sexist about it, some people are homophobic about it, whatever, but we're all trying to create God in our own image, and I think that I hope, I believe that the gospel resists that and actually condemns it.
Yeah, I don't know to feel better or bad about this, but it seemed like that's been the issue since day one. Like you have James and Peter arguing with Paul about who belongs in the kingdom in the very first years of Christianity. And we've come forward 2,000 years and we still have the same kind of talks or debates.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Peter and James were not on the same page with Paul in the first century, which I think is a beautiful way to start the gospel. So there's no pristine perfection in the beginning. It's like they already weren't getting along about a very big issue, namely who's in and who's out. And, I can imagine in my mind's eye the conversation between Peter and James and Paul. And Peter's like, listen, I'm like the handpicked super disciple. I'm telling you, Paul, Gentiles, they can't just come in as Gentiles. And James is like, Jesus is my brother, for God's sake. What, Paul, who do you think you are? And Paul goes, listen, I'm a Jew. I understand this, but I can't explain this Jesus that I met. it doesn't fit into those categories. And that's not an anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic comment. Paul is not anti-Semitic. Paul is Paul. He was Jewish, and he thought of himself as that, and he thought of Jesus as completing this Jewish story. But it's something about the revelation, let's say, of the God of Abraham in Christ that expands our consciousness, expands our expectations. And if we hold on to those expectations that we have too tightly, we're going to be in conflict with other people.
Yeah, I can get on board with a God that always expands our expectations. That's always more than we want. Sort of like the Augustine story about the beach and this kid digging a hole, and he's like, "You can't get the whole ocean in there." And he's like, "Yeah, but I can get part of it in there, and I can see a little bit of it. And you can't get all of God into your gospel or onto your words or mind."
Well, we're dealing with an infinite God and an infinite cosmos. I mean, that's the thing that's always sobering to me, that, if God exists, God must be more unfathomable than that 1/1,000,000th of 1% that we understand of the cosmos, which is already too much. So, I just feel like I shouldn't be talking much at this point. What can I add to the conversation other than engaging this biblical story that we have and seeing it not as, I don't want to be misunderstood here, depending on who's listening, but looking at the story not as sort of the last thing to be said about what God does, but as propelling us on a trajectory where we're going to actually expect God to do new things and not to just, stay with the system. Systems always have a way of offering too much, and I think the gospel is about not being beholden to these systems that we create.
If there's one thing in my faith I'm struggling with or wrestling with right now, it's making space for the idea that I'm wrong about some things. And I'm pretty okay with that. But then recognizing that I'm wrong about some things means I have to make space for the fact that other people might be right.
Yeah.
God bless them. I just really want to be right, and I don't want other people to be right. And saying that they might be right and I might be wrong, it does something to me. And maybe that's mine to work out with my therapist after Bill gets done with the couples counseling. But
with the therapist you keep on retainer, apparently, to handle stuff like
I've got a lot of issues.
But yeah, well, don't we all? And the thing is that, I don't mind saying too, I like being right. I like being right about what I just said a half minute ago. Right. But it's about, it's cliche, but learning to hold on to those things that we think we're right about with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. That's hard. We can have our convictions and say, listen, I just don't think that X, Y, or Z is consistent with the gospel. And I can argue for it and I can want to be right. But at the end, I think we have to be open to how, and this is a rather sweeping statement, but I'm going to stick by it, how our words at the end of the day are ultimately inadequate and how they can actually be traps for us in how we think.
I struggle with the idea that it seemed like Jesus was always more concerned with relationship than being right. And there was times that it seemed like he embraces bad theology for the sake of keeping a relationship going. And that's something I can learn from.
Yeah. A bad theology from the point of view of those who are guarding the theology.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But not actually bad theology.
We brought you on here because we want our vast audience of my mom and
why am I
6
here?
sisters. My mom and 6 sisters don't know about your book. And that's our audience, is my family. So
okay,
we wanted you to be able to talk about your book a little bit. You've got a brand new book out called How the Bible Actually Works. And when I first saw the title,
right.
I thought I would open it up and be one page that said open and read, but there is a lot more to it than that, right?
Yeah. So that was a fun book to write. But yeah, How the Bible Actually Works, which is an intentionally snarky-ish kind of title, because that's just how I have fun with things. But at the end of the day, there are all different ways that the Bible works, but all different points can be made that I think are legitimate. But the point that I'm making in the book, basically, stop me when you want me to, but the point that I'm making in the book basically is that there are certain properties of the Bible that everybody knows are there, and we usually spend a lot of time trying to push to the side or explain away or somehow defend. And those properties are, the Bible comes to us from a very, very ancient time that's nothing like the world we live in. It's also ambiguous. You'd think the Bible would be super clear on very important things, but it's not. There are different opinions, and the opinions that are there, they don't really spell out exactly what we should be thinking or doing. And then the third thing related to that is that the Bible is actually diverse. It has different points of view on different things, not the least of which is what God is like. We have in the Bible different portraits of God that are very, very hard to keep together. From our point of view, I think we'd have to say they actually contradict each other. And those things are not problems, but they're actually showing us something about the character of the Bible that we need to take seriously. And what those three things do for us, sort of taken as a whole, is pushing us towards thinking of the Bible as a source of wisdom where we have to invest in ourselves and think through how best to reflect God and our faith in the world around us, rather than looking to the Bible for a verse that will tell us exactly what to do about this situation, because those verses are ancient, they're ambiguous, and they may very likely be contradicted by something else.
When I was reading the book, I couldn't help but get caught by an irony. In your previous books, you've tackled a lot of misconceptions about the Bible, and one of the misconceptions you really look at in this book is that the Bible is not a guidebook. But ironically, it almost seems like you've created a guidebook on reading the Bible in some sense.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I think I've definitely created maybe not a step-by-step guidebook, but like giving a guide to the overall impression of how the Bible works. But then saying that as you go and read it, there's no guidebook to tell you like what to do with it. So it is sort of like a reorienting exercise. For some readers, it's a reorienting exercise in things that, the Bible for Normal People, the podcast we have, and my website, we always frame things with two questions. What is the Bible anyway? And what do we do with it? And I think the way the Bible is shaped actually encourages those questions. What do I do with this text? What do I do with these books, these letters? How do I have a conversation between this antiquity and my own moment? And that's called theology. That's just what people have always had to do since the very beginning. Since before there actually was a Bible, that like in the way that we know it, this is what people of faith have been doing. And I think the Bible actually encourages us to step out on what I call that path toward wisdom, and not just finding verses in the Bible to, actually short circuit that search for wisdom.
That's a very good point. I don't guess you probably know me and Bill's background, but we both grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and we're now Methodist pastors who have a podcast about Jesus being a hippie. So we've been on a little bit of a faith journey. And I wonder if you could tell us, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your faith journey from where you grew up to where you are now, writing a book about how the Bible actually works and hosting your podcast, and how's your faith evolved kind of over the years?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, my background, I guess, was raised by German immigrant parents. They came over in the 1950s. I was born in 1961. And being raised with, I just always believed that there was a God. And I just sort of always knew that as a child. But we didn't really go to church or anything. I think partly because my parents didn't know English that well, and probably some other reasons. So I was raised with that sort of understanding. When we got older, they sent my sister and I to a Lutheran church because, they're Germans. So you're Lutheran or you're Catholic. You're one or the other. It was there that I had really official church training in the Lutheran church in like middle school and junior high school. And, that was about it. When I was confirmed Lutheran, nothing really stuck with me. I did a lot. I mean, in retrospect, it was a great couple of years of education, but I didn't really internalize it. It didn't transform me, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So in high school, I had a conversion experience in a Nazarene church in New Jersey, Emmanuel Church of the Nazarene, I think it was called. No, wait a second. What was it called? No, I don't know what it's called now, actually. It used to be called New Milford Church of the Nazarene, but pastor there who was very influential early on, Charlie Rizzo was his name. Maybe he's listening. But he was a pastor there. And I had a conversion experience. But, that sort of didn't stick either, in part because I was older and I was starting to have a lot of questions. I found myself in a Christian college, which was great, again, for me, a formative experience, Messiah College, which is in central Pennsylvania. But it was really, I definitely was Christian self-consciously and actively, but I just was sort of still coasting along on autopilot. And, long story short, it was after I graduated college that I came to realize how I didn't take seriously this faith that I claimed was my own. And that drove me to doing a lot of reading, which is weird because I never was a reader in high school or college. I read what I had to, but I'm not one of these people to sit down, I can't wait to get a book open. It's more like, what game is on, or is there a great movie that I can go to or just sort of hang out? So for me to read is sort of a big change in and of itself. But I read voraciously for about 3 years, and it wound up getting me to seminary. And, during seminary, I had more sort of movements of my thinking and of my soul where I realized I wanted to study Old Testament in a real academic setting, and to like a research institution, not in a seminary, but to move beyond that to something else. And it was really there that when I was in graduate school at Harvard from 1989 to 1994, where I became exposed to broader ways of thinking about the ancient Israelites and where they came from and where the Bible comes from, and looking at it in its ancient context. And that was very, very helpful and enlightening to me. It satisfied a lot of my curiosities. But after I left, I came back to Westminster Seminary, which is where I was a student before I went to Harvard. And, it's a pretty conservative place. It wasn't that conservative when I started teaching there, but it still was. And I began wrestling with this synthesis. And I know so many people have just day to day, not in an academic sense, but just real stuff that happens day to day. I began having to synthesize this world, this very broad, expansive world of scholarship and a tradition that doesn't really appreciate that world very much. And that caused me to do a lot of thinking about stuff, and it drove me to think more and more, and then to start, writing books about it and having a website where I was blogging and now a podcast. It's something that I keep thinking about, and I like putting my thoughts out there so people can think about them too. And, having a podcast is great because we have guests on and they say a lot of interesting stuff. So, it sort of keeps going on and on. I was always curious, and that curiosity hasn't stopped. And it's definitely taken me down a path where today, spiritually, I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago.
You've got a podcast, The Bible for Normal People, and with that kind of a website and a community. How has that shaped your faith?
That's a good question. I mean, it's easier to see how my faith has shaped my need to do that, but how that has shaped my faith, I think partly I always have in front of me how many different experiences there are among people who claim the Christian faith and how they've come to different conclusions. So I guess it's coming really more concretely face to face with the diversity of thinking there is among people who say they're trying to follow Jesus and they consider themselves Christian. And that's a good thing. I mean, I like that, but it's still also something that I wish it were simpler and more obvious. I wish we could all be on the same page about everything, but I think that's not the way of Christianity. I think it is a diverse faith. And so I'm reminded of that. I think we all of us who come from, like you guys, Southern Baptists, Methodists, now hippies, right? You have your own trajectory. I have mine. And sometimes those voices from our deep past, they come up when we don't expect it, saying things like, "You really lost it, didn't you? Boy, you used to be such a great Christian. Now look at you. Look what you're thinking now." And I have to always shut those voices down. I think having a podcast and blogging and all that just reminds me of this bigger reality that I have to be aware of, and to not give into those voices, but to move forward where I'd like to think, like we were saying before, God is bigger than our thinking. God's bigger than my limited ways of thinking. Maybe God is out ahead of us and not sort of behind us, calling us to come back. God's ahead of us. God's not a he, but God is ahead of us, pushing us forward into places that we might not even be aware of, or we might not feel comfortable going to if we knew they were there.
overarching theme of your book is wisdom. If I got it right, if I was correct when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
So pretend I'm a normal person and not me who is below normal, and try to tell me what exactly is wisdom. As I'm reading the book, I hear wisdom a lot, but I want to know what wisdom is.
Right. Well, I mean, wisdom is a pretty important biblical concept. It's in the Old Testament very prominently in places like Proverbs and a bunch of other places as well. And it's also in the book of James. James is very prominent in wisdom, and the Gospels have their moments too. But, the idea of wisdom is simply this, that, I mean, the analogy I use is with parenting, right? So parents do the best when they raise their kids not to make sure you follow this rule that I'm giving you and never think for yourself. Because parents can't anticipate every scenario that comes up. It's better to teach kids how to think rather than exactly here are the 5 rules you live by and you don't deviate from them. So, good parents let their kids stumble and figure things out. They're not helicopter parents where they're making sure their kids can go through life and everything turns out right. Or like I've heard from other people, lawnmower parents, who sort of blaze the trail in front and knock all the weeds out of the way so they can have a nice, easy walk. That's not wisdom. That's fear, actually. And that's not training a child to grow up to be a truly healthy, independent, thinking human being who is on a path to communion with God, but who realizes that this is much more wonderful than simply looking for answers in an index book someplace. But you have to figure out life as you're moving along. I think the life of faith is the same way. It's not about here are the rules, stick by them, and everything will be fine. It's like this is God's creation. You're a part of it. To figure out how life works, to navigate well along this path that we live, this path of life, to do it in God's presence as best as you can, and to realize that you'll grow and you'll make some mistakes, but it's all good at the end. And I think that's really, for me, a very healthy way to live. And it really is, I won't go on and on, but it's really helpful to look at just one passage that I talk about in the book, Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Very, very famous. Many, many people have heard of it. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, because you'll be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes. Now, those two proverbs contradict each other, right? Like, what do I do with this fool that I know at work? Do I answer them or not answer them? And the biblical answer is yes. You do one of those two things. Which one do you do? Well, if you look into the book of Proverbs for like a verse to go to tell you what to do in every situation, you're going to miss a lot of it. You've got these two verses side by side that contradict, which is telling us, as it's been telling readers since the beginning, the key to wisdom is not read the verse. The key to wisdom is reading your experience, reading the situation that you're in, and then asking yourself, how is God best honored at this moment? And that's never a cookbook. That's never just a recipe that you follow. That's something that you live into, and that I say, quite frankly, you have to figure out and learn from mistakes, and you learn from others who have gone down these paths and have things to offer you, which is why Proverbs is all about, listen, my son, to what I say. Yeah. It's not thus saith the Lord. It's, listen, kid, I picked some stuff up here in life, and I want you to listen to what I'm saying. And I want you to immerse yourself in this wisdom as you learn to go through life. And I think that's a beautiful way to think about the Christian life, rather than how many of us have been taught, I think, wittingly or unwittingly in churches, that this is about following a certain set of rules. And if you deviate, if you color outside of the lines, if you wander off the beach blanket, or whatever metaphor you want to use, God's going to get you, because God is ultimately pissed. And God's going to come after you, and you cannot deviate from this. And if you do, there'll be judgment, there'll be vindication, vindictiveness, revenge, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not making that up. I mean, I know people who think like that.
Yeah.
And they don't want to. They're struggling with that, right?
I mean, that was the whole Great Awakening, sinners in the hand of an angry God, and, everything that's been built into that over the last couple hundred years.
Right.
When you say that, it
but
reminds me.
just to follow on that, though, not to interrupt, but I will, because I'm the guest. I can do what I want, right?
That's right.
But see, the thing about God, the Bible is a rule book that idea does come in part from the Bible itself. When you have strong rules in Deuteronomy, and at the end, if you deviate from this, if people have never read chapters like 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy, please stop what you're doing and read it now. You'll see the point. The punishments are horrible. I mean, it's like an over-the-top drunk father, like saying, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill everybody you know, if you're getting raped, I'm going to let it happen. All this kind of, it's horrible. And then the rewards for keeping the covenant, keeping the rules, are wonderful. They're the opposite. And so we get that idea from the Bible itself, but not from the entire Bible. And that's why this diversity in our Bible is something we have to take very seriously, which is one of the big parts of the book. If you just latch onto one portrait of how God works without understanding why would ancient people write it that way, then I think we're going to have a distorted picture of God at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it seems like, though, as we read through the Old Testament, it's constantly God promising judgment, but ending up giving mercy and giving them one more chance. I'm thinking about that Exodus passage where he summons snakes and they're going to bite everyone and kill them all. And then he's like, okay, Moses, we'll make this staff and then everyone will be well. There's always promises of judgment, but they never seem to come to fruition. There's always this air on mercy at the last minute. And I guess to me, that's kind of who God is. The God's always going to err on the side of mercy and always give people one more chance. And that's part of how I understand God.
Well, I agree with that. I think, though, that, for example, Golden Calf, so in Exodus, where God is saying, Moses, just move to the side. I'm going to kill them all. And Moses says he intercedes, which is a nice way of saying he talks God out of it. So don't do that. Listen, you think about this for a minute. If you do this, all the nations are going to look at you and say, what kind of a God is this who brings his people out of Egypt and wipes them out? So Moses plays on God's sense of honor and shame, which is, of course, part of the ancient world.
Yes.
And God says, okay, listen, you're right. I won't do it, but I'm going to kill some of them, right? So, that portrayal of God is very disturbing for people, and I think it should be. But that doesn't mean we can't learn something from it, like what you're saying. It's at the end there is mercy, but sometimes you have to go further down the road in reading the Bible to see that.
And I think that passage in particular, and a number of passages throughout the Old Testament, open up questions of how do we understand God and what do we think about God? Because it seems that God's changing God's mind, God's being, reasoned or talked out of doing judgmental things, God's remorseful and sorry. God seems to have a very human experience throughout part of the Old Testament.
Yeah, which is part and parcel of the ancient world where gods are bigger versions of just people. And you see this with like the pantheons of the Romans, the Greeks, but even before that, the peoples of the ancient world, whether Egyptians or Babylonians or Assyrians, you see these gods that are basically big versions of kings and monarchs. And you see some of that also in the Old Testament. God is portrayed that way as well, but other times, surprisingly not. You have these diverse portraits within the Old Testament itself of what kind of a God we're dealing with here, and whether this is a God that just is the same as the voice of a king, which is not the case in the Bible. That's a very liberating notion, I think, that God can't be co-opted by political power. It's within the Bible itself. God has a lot of problems with kings. Elsewhere, this isn't all the time, but elsewhere in the ancient world, what the king says is what God says. It's that simple. And the Israelite kings don't have that liberty ever. They're always subject to something higher than themselves, which is, one of these moves, I guess, in the story of Israel that is interesting. That makes you think, what? Oh, that's interesting. In a world like that, to talk about God and kings like this, that's very odd.
Which feeds into, I guess, your point about the Bible being ambiguous and, having different meanings in different places and sometimes arguing with itself.
Because it's a story. We're going places. Well, first of all, the Bible was written by one person in one sitting. It's a collection of various kinds of writings that span hundreds of years, different people, different personalities, different sort of geopolitical realities, different circumstances. And so they wind up expressing their faith in God and what God is like differently, I think in large part because of when and where and why these things were written. So the Bible is is a diverse book because it's something that comes to us from a very broad span of time. And you see movement, you see changes, you see developments, you see, like, even if I can use the word, an evolution in thinking about what God is like, where, maybe God is not against our enemies automatically. Maybe God actually cares about even people like the Assyrians, the people of Nineveh. That's the story of Jonah, that God actually cares for this ancient enemy that in the book of Nahum, God has every intention of wiping out completely.
And Jonah's kind of pissed about
Too
it.
portraits.
I noticed in the book, when you follow this path of thinking, you use a phrase, reimagining God. I know people that using that kind of phrase, reimagining God, would set off alarm bells. Why did you choose that phrase instead of a more acceptable phrase like, God revealing God's self anew?
Well, I think in part because why is it better to say God's revealing God's self anew when those new revelations contradict earlier ones? See what's gained by that? Because then you have God revealing God's self in ways that are just different, diametrically opposed. Like the Jonah and Nahum thing with what God thinks of the people of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Just one example. So I think, something is protected there, but something else is given.
One of the things on that same day is you talked about the story of Noah in your book, and it really sparked my imagination, and I began to reimagine it from the way I had imagined it before. I generally interpret that story as a story of resurrection and restoration, but suddenly I found myself thinking about what questions could the original writers have been asking. Maybe they were asking, why does God allow evil to persist in the world? And then we get our answer as soon as Noah gets off the ark. He immediately plants a vineyard and gets trashed. And so I see this, because people are people. That's why God doesn't intervene. Is this the kind of thinking you're inviting your readers to do?
Sure, or any other kind of thinking, because I think the Bible is a book that invites us to think deeply, and I know that because we have, over 2,000 years history of Jewish schools of study and nearly 2 millennia of Christian houses of study, which are now called seminaries. This is not a book that we sort of, take off the shelf, hit a chapter in the morning while you're having your coffee and say, I pretty much got this, I nailed it. There is so much happening there. Like the story of Noah, that's what people call a gapped story. So many of the stories in the Bible are gapped. In other words, they're not addressing questions we might have as we're reading it. Maybe a clearer example, like the Cain and Abel story. Where did Cain get his wife from? Right? Yeah. That's the story does not address that question. Doesn't answer it. We try to find answers, but it's not there. So the Bible is actually, we're invariably put into a place where we have to think and we have to decide what's going on here. And then you might have a different interpretation from somebody else. But, welcome to adult Bible reading, folks. This is what happens. You have the whole Jewish tradition that, the Talmudic tradition where Jews are actively disagreeing or debating what passages mean, but then they don't try to resolve that. The tradition doesn't resolve it. They just move on to the next thing. Because the conversation's important.
Yeah, that Cain and Abel story got me into a lot of trouble in high school. I used to ask my youth director, where did all those people come from that are supposed to abuse Cain? Do you suppose that's evolution? It just drove him nuts.
I can imagine.
And that's why.
Well, the thing is, you don't have to go to evolution to figure that one out, though, because, I think Genesis 1 has the creation of many, many people, male and female. Like it's sort of like a mass creation of people. The Adam and Eve story, I mean, not to get into this is sort of convoluted, but the Adam and Eve story is more about God's special relationship with what will become Israel. And so, where does, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, they're sort of right there, close to paradise, but then Cain has to run away to where all those other people live. right? Not these special people, but all these other people. So it's natural in reading the story that, well, of course there are people out there. He's going to build a city. People are going to live there. He's going to get a wife and kids, and he's afraid of a posse coming after him because of what he did to his brother. But to me, that makes a logical sense if you read chapters 1 and 2 sequentially. The Adam and Eve story and the 7 days creation, read that sequentially and not as if they're happening at the same time, which is a common way that conservatives read Genesis 1 and 2, but it doesn't work.
That is not how my youth director answered that question.
Right.
Yeah.
How good it would be if our youth had youth leaders who not only had a subtlety with some of these stories, but were parts of churches where it was expected that you would encourage young people to engage these stories on an adult level eventually.
As a good Wesleyan, though, as I read your book and kept encountering wisdom over and over again, I couldn't help but feel like there was a connection to both discernment and sanctification as I read about wisdom.
Wow. That's a good Wesleyan kind of thing to say. No, I think you're right, because discernment and wisdom go hand in hand. And sanctification is, in my opinion, the process of gaining, the process of becoming more godly. And the more godly you are, guess what? The wiser you are. It's not I'm more godly and now I don't drink beer anymore, or I don't smoke. That's not godliness. Godliness is being connected deeply with the world that you live in, which is the world that God created. To me, that's the part of at least sanctification. It's usually put in strictly moral terms, but I think it's, like the Orthodox might put it as like deification in a sense. We don't become God, but we become, more than just what we were. We become intimate with God, God's children, as the Bible says. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it. Discernment and sanctification are concepts that I think we can very easily fold into this idea of wisdom.
Yeah, you, I guess, brought up earlier, talking about the Jewish tradition of debating and arguing and disagreeing and not trying to resolve or fix it. And somehow I feel like that's something we desperately need in 21st century America, the ability to have civil conversation and debate with people that we disagree. Any idea how we can capture some of that or bring it back?
No, because I think it's so deeply ingrained. I mean, I think in like the American political scene, the polarizing of things, I think, is very difficult, and not seeing that there are maybe different legitimate views to almost anything we can think of, and working together makes a lot more sense. It's worse, to my opinion, when it's in the church itself, which of course is the history of denominationalism. It's just a higher form of tribalism, where we're the ones who are right, other people are wrong. And for example, as one of my professors in the seminary that I went to and then taught at said, we don't exist to work with other denominations. We exist to correct them. We hold the truth in trust for them, for as soon as they're ready for it, they'll understand it. That doesn't encourage dialogue and a humility to say, listen, we might be wrong about some of this stuff. And I think, I don't know how to make that happen. I only know that in my own life, it's been something that has been happening for years now. And the reason it happens is because I came up against just brick wall after brick wall. I don't even mean just intellectually, but also emotionally. My whole life stopped making sense. And I had to let go of, what I call in another book I wrote, the one before this last one, the sin of certainty, of thinking that the whole point of this is to be absolutely sure and be absolutely right. It's not. It may be much more interesting than that, not just our little human frail minds thinking we've cornered the market on God.
I jokingly say all the time that I've never met a lesson I didn't want to learn the hard way. And I've got a feeling that as America, we're learning a lot of lessons the hard way now through our stubbornness. I've got, I guess, one more question, then we'll go to our final question for you. The Sin of Certainty is one of maybe 4 books that wrecked my life in all the right ways and gave words to some things that I was struggling with. What's a book or a teaching or something that you ran into once in your life that just opened your eyes, or you're like, oh, I've been trying to say that, or, oh, I don't like that, but it makes sense and I should try to do it more?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's one that I keep coming back to, and I talk about it in the sin of certainty. And anytime, like, I'm in front of people and I talk about the reality of doubt in the Christian life, this always comes up. But it's this famous story of Mother Teresa and John Kavanaugh. John Kavanaugh was a philosopher at St. Louis University. He just died a few short years ago. But in the 70s, he was having a crisis of faith, and he went to visit Mother Teresa and figuring, he took a sabbatical or something and figured, she'll have the answer. She's Mother Teresa. If she doesn't know, who will? So trying to get some sense of stability and certitude and all that stuff in his life. And he went to her and met her, and she said, "What can I do for you?" He said, "You can pray for me." And she said, "What can I pray for?" And he said, "Pray that I have clarity." And she said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And he said, "Well, why not?" So I sort of like blew a plane ticket to come out here. Why not? And she said, and this is what she said. She said, "Because clarity is the last thing you are clinging must let go of." And I read that in the midst of struggling with own issues of faith and what tradition I belong to, and how do I know if I'm right? How do I know if any of this makes sense? And when she said that, I just sensed to myself, like, I've been doing this wrong. I've been wanting to hold on to clarity when I'm talking about an infinite God. How dare I?
Yeah.
How dare I want intellectual clarity in my life? But then he said to her, and this is the second thing, the 1-2 punch of Mother Teresa. He said, "Well, you seem to have tons of clarity." And she just laughed. And she just says, "I've never had clarity a day in my life. But what I've had is trust. So I will pray that you trust rather than seek clarity." And that, again, was so simple. It's so childlike. Like children, they don't have clarity about the character of their parents. They just sort of trust their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I figure, I've been doing this really wrong, and I can't blame myself because I think the traditions that I've been a part of, I've been doing it wrong. And that was just and that changed me significantly, that it's okay not to be certain. Trusting God, even if you don't know what that means, taking little baby steps, and sometimes they're bigger steps, that's a part of the Christian life. We don't know with our left brains as much as we think we know. This may be more of a right brain thing, of intuition, of communion, and of basically getting out of the way of your ego.
As we get ready to close, and before somebody calls the police and accuses us of holding you hostage to do this interview, we just want to know, what is it that's saving your soul right now?
Well, I think, this is a really little weird thing, but I stumbled on this a few weeks ago. A friend of mine mentioned an app to me. See, because I actually struggle with prayer. I always have, because my brain gets in the way and I think about things too much. And that's why contemplative prayer is hard, because I have to be silent. And I need major drugs and adult supervision to not have my brain go around and round. And I know that that's the wrong way to think about it, but it's been hard for me. But I'm looking for ways to commune quietly with God on a daily basis. And there is a wonderful app out there. I want to use my phone for good and not for evil. There's a wonderful app out there, Pray As You Go. And there are 10-minute little lessons each morning that's simple, with some music and some Bible reading and some Bible meditation, where a couple of people, and they're British, so the accents are great, they just sort of walk you through this reading of the day and what it might mean to you, and think about how you were when you experienced, or look forward to going through something that's meaningful to me.
Bill was pointing at me because I talked about that app not too long ago and how I was using it. So,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my spiritual director gave it to me. And there's another prayer app that does the examine and will walk you through the examine at the end of your day that I like to use. And yeah, the two of them together really, I guess, also help me, who likes to think about everything a lot, kind of get out of my own way and get out of my head. Which is a hard thing for some of us to do. And I know that Pray As You Go has an examine feature to it. You have to dig it out, but it's in there. There's a lot of they have different kinds of prayers for different seasons, and they have the examine in there too. So I think that's pretty cool. Technology can be good. It can be good. It can be used for good. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This has been fantastic. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pete.
Oh, great. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. It's great to be with you.